Okay, welcome back to another episode of The Miles Driven. Now, if you haven't checked out the channel before, just bear in mind that we do have buyer's guides for the P38, L322 and L405 generation. So if after this video you think to yourself, yeah, quite interested in a Range Rover now, I'll link those up and you can check those videos out. So the key thing to remember with Range Rover ownership is we're now 5 generations in, and over that 5 generations, there are 2 types of people that have evolved. You've got people that love them, they've driven them once, they've decided this is the car for them, and they will buy them over and over and over again. And then you've got the other side of Range Rover ownership. I'm just going to say it's the other side, and those people have probably already found this video. They've probably already clicked on it, written their comment, and yeah, we're about 20 seconds in. They probably would have about now clicked off because they've got to write their comment and then they've left. And what they'll say is something like, don't buy it, worst car ever, worst purchase they've ever made. And what I would say is critical before you go out and buy a Range Rover is to decide which type of buyer you are. Okay, and if you have this in mind, you should have a good ownership experience. There are the types of owners that are enthusiasts. Okay, so when I bought my Range Rover, I knew that I was going to be willing to work on it as long as the job didn't need some sort of heavy lifting equipment. There were a lot of things that I could do. Then there's people that don't want to touch their car. Okay, now if you are one of those people, the answer is warranty. But the answer isn't any warranty. The answer is looking on forums and finding people that have had that generation that you're looking at, have had a warranty company, a particular brand, wherever in the world you are, and that have said, yes, they've covered things, they've covered the common things. That's critical. On the other side of it, if you're an enthusiast, well, there's a world of choice for you. But of course, no one wants to spend their whole life under their car, which is probably why you found this video. So across the 5 generations, you've got the Classic. That's 1970 until we get to the P38 generation. On that generation, you're going to have, I think it's 4 diesel variants. So you start off with a VM diesel, move on to the 200 TDI, then 300 TDI. In my view, the one to buy is the 300 TDI. Although if you're struggling to find it, the 200 TDI is a pretty good buy as well. It's just, you've got to consider modern traffic today. Okay, these will be the later engines. They'll also be a bit better in modern traffic. But if I'm honest, all of the diesels on this generation, they will feel like you're having to really keep up with people in Volkswagen Golfs and Toyota Corollas. Okay, if it's possible, and if you don't really need a diesel, because the other thing with the diesel on this generation is a lot of the first, second, third owners, and we're talking people who owned the car 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they would have likely been using it for some sort of recreational purpose, whether that was that they just wanted to go off-roading, or if it was a work purpose and it was going to be used for farming or any sort of, estate management or whatever else it may be, and they just wanted a nice car to do it in. Now, if you go to the other side of this, which is the Rover V8 petrols, these were generally bought by people that wanted to use them in the city, maybe a bit of casual off-roading, go to their house in the wherever it may be, wherever in the world you are, that nice area that you know about. And that's probably the owners that you want to be buying after, because down their process, they're not going to have been using it as much off-road. But if we're just talking about the engine, okay, there is a carburetor. Some people really like the carburetor 3.5. It's a Rover V8, which, as most people know, has its history as a Buick V8. But I would go for electric fuel injection. I would go for the 3.9. Okay, the 3.9, it has good power, about 185, 190 horsepower. It also, it's around for a little while, so you should have some choice. The 3.5 with the electric fuel injection, that's just fine. But out of the 2, if you can get that bit more power, there is a later engine, I think it's 4.2, and that's, I think, 200-ish horsepower. But to be honest, for the extra sort of 10 horsepower gain, I'd look at that 3.9. I think that was just the sweet spot. I think by the time they'd got to that later engine, the Range Rover was kind of known, and a lot of people who'd owned them had owned them, and they're kind of waiting for that next generation, which is what we'll come on to next, and that is the P38 or P38a generation. Here you've either got a BMW 2.5 diesel, okay, that's the only option if you want a diesel. Pretty good engine, should keep up with modern traffic just about, doesn't have a lot of the modern day emissions equipment on it, so again, should be very reliable. These engines in BMWs, they've done hundreds of thousands of miles multiple hundreds of thousands of miles in if you're doing it in kilometers. You know, some have hit the 500,000 kilometer mark. So that engine reliable. Okay, the big challenge you're going to have is finding one that's in good shape. When I was working in classic car photography and classic car editing, I used to see quite a lot of this generation. Most of them were now the 4 and the 4.6 for the same reason kind of as the Classic. The original owners of the diesels wanted them for maybe a little bit more agricultural purpose. So if we're looking at the petrols, and this is kind of the one I would look at, there isn't a lot between the 4 and the 4.6. However, this is just from experience, and it's actually, I'll tell you a quick story. I went out to see two brothers, both owned Range Rover P38s when I was working with Classics. They were planning on selling them. I said, you know, well, why did one of you buy the 4 and one the 4.6? Was it just you wanted a bit more power? And they, you know, there was a little bit of brotherly competition, and one had a special edition and one got the colour they wanted and all this sort of stuff. But what they felt, and I think I'd echo this, because I think when you look at cars along it, Mercedes particularly have this, if you look at like their 65 AMG range versus the 63. When you get to the point of the highest horsepower, largest engine, it usually isn't quite as popular, and it usually comes later in the day than the one just before it. So in this case, the 4 litre came first, then the 4.6. When the 4.6 comes in, it's a bit later in the day, and if you look at their depreciation curve, the 4 has the sort of regular, you know, drops off a hill initially and then keeps going down and down, and then it sort of bottomed out probably in the year 2018, something like that, 2019, and then since then they've been on this steady increase. The 4.6 has gone through a different depreciation curve. Because it was more expensive to begin with, it had an initial huge drop, but then if people were looking to buy this as a, you know, third or fourth owner car, where these cars really start to struggle usually is their third or fourth owner. Okay, when they're sometimes being bought as a purchase that people haven't maybe gone on the internet like you and spent some time with me to learn about which one's the one to go for. They've had problems, they've sort of been bodged together to get them sold, and that's the end of the story. And then you end up buying it and it's a wreck. So the 4.6, as these two brothers were telling me, when they were looking for their Range Rovers, the 4.6, they just found better examples, just every single time. Compared to the 4, they found some great ones. Obviously, he bought one of the brothers, but the other one said it didn't take him very long. He looked at one 4.6, quite liked it, saw another one that same day, quite liked that one, and then the day after went to see another one, was the one he had in his mind that he'd probably buy, special edition, and boom, he went for it. So in my mind, I'd go for the 4.6, just because I think it's going to have owners that have wanted to spend a bit more money for the entire life of that car, and in that case, they've probably been a little bit keener to spend the money when it's needed. Next is probably my favourite and many of yours favourite, and it's the L322 generation. This is the car, to be honest, it's either completely misunderstood online or people get it. Okay, so BMW spent €1 billion when they were developing this car. I think actually that's $1 billion. I don't think it's €1 billion, but I could be wrong. Huge development behind the chassis, and it really stands out in the range because this is the last time the Range Rover has its own separate chassis and is its own car, because once we go on to the next generation in the moment, the L405, that shares its chassis with the Discovery 5, with the Range Rover Sport, and obviously itself. So this, I feel, is a bit of a special vehicle, but I understand it's got a lot of criticisms. It went through 2 generations, or actually 3 generations of ownership. So there's launch, it's basically a BMW developed, that's unfair, a BMW funded development as a joint project with the X5, but it is made by the Land Rover, it's not JLR at the time, by Land Rover engineers. Okay, so it's unfair for me to sort of put them to the side. They were behind the car. But in 2001, if you got in one and then you got in a BMW, you could kind of feel some cross DNA there. Seats are a bit firmer, the way it drives, it does feel like there's a little bit of BMW-esque-ness to it. Not a lot, but a bit. When we get onto the facelift, that's where the Ford era sort of comes over, and they kind of let Land Rover sort of be themselves a bit more. And it's here, so this is the sweet spot for me, which is 2005 to 2009. There's the 4.2 Supercharged V8. Now, I know some of you love the diesels. I had, so this, before anyone calls me biased, I owned the 3.6 TD-V8 diesel, which was, I think, 2006 to 2009. I chose that one over the 4.2, but to me, if it's reliability that's number one for you, go for the 4.2 V8. They also did a 4.4 V8 in that same period of time. That would be the pick as well. But to me, you get more power, just a bit more going for it in the 4.2. And again, if we look at that depreciation curve, particularly if you're in the US, so you had the 4.2 and the 4.4. In the UK, we had just the 4.2. We had the 4.4 for 1 year, and then it disappeared because pretty much everyone was buying the V8 diesel when that came up. If it's got to be a diesel engine, then there's the late facelift. This is 2009 onwards to 2012, 4.4 TD-V8 at that point. That's the one to go for. 8-speed gearbox, the only L322 to get an 8-speed. Great horsepower, 30 miles to the gallon, which if you've been a Range Rover owner, I think in 1975, and then you've owned them ever since, I think you'd have given up on the ideas of ever seeing 30s average mile per gallon. So to have one that comes out and says, it's a V8, yes, it's diesel, but it performs amazingly, 8-speed gearbox, 30 miles to the gallon on average, you probably wouldn't have believed anyone until you've driven it. So if it's got to be a diesel, I would look at that one. The 3.6 is a good engine, but does suffer with some turbos and things like that. So you can check out the extended guide that I did for the L322 if that one really interests you. But to me, 4.2 supercharged, it's got to be diesel, 4.4 TD-V8 09 to 12. Then we come on to the L405 generation. This is the one that I think today is getting the most attention. It was made from 2013. I think actually production may have started. No, I think it is 2013. I don't think they made any late in 2012. So 2013 all the way up until 2021. The new generation then comes in 2022. Because this has got so much media attention, they got stolen a lot. Okay, it's the cross generation where we moved to a new type of vehicle security systems. You can go into the news stories. I'm sure you already know about them. From an engine point of view, it's really interesting because this moves along a period of engines and sort of Land Rover's movement forward. So they become JLR in 2011. I think I'm right in saying that. So there is a lot of now shared. There was shared before, but there's more of a sort of cohesive movement between Jaguar and Land Rover. We know that with the Range Rover Velar, Jaguar F-Pace in that side of things. But this, from a reliability standpoint, there's really two attitudes that people take. Some people love the SD-V8, which is the TD-V8 developed on. A lot of people will tell you a lot of bad things about the 3-litre SD-V6. So these are the diesel engines. What I'm going to say is, if it's got to be diesel, I know it's going to be the top end of everyone's budget, but there's a D300. This comes out late in the game. This is actually the Ingenium engine that's used on the latest, the L460 generation. Come on to that in a second. But that, it has incredible performance, even better fuel economy, and it really suits, it's got that smooth 6-cylinder to it. It does suit the way you would drive a Range Rover. Not to say the diesel V8 doesn't, but I have seen a few too many reports now that make it difficult for me to say it's the one to go for, only because I think some people have bought it, they've cared for it, they've owned it well, and you'll buy it and it'll be a great car. There's a lot of other people that have been using it as a show-off type vehicle, maybe. I don't want to be too unfair to people, or maybe they just weren't 100% aware of some of the extra care it would need as it went through its age and went past the 100, 120,000, 140,000 mile marker. That's sort of your 200,000 kilometer marker, if you want the metrics. That to me is the point where these engines do need a little bit of extra care, and if you haven't got a good specialist, it can be a bit. I'm not saying they're bad engines. I'm just saying, as a used buy, if you can stretch to it, D300 if it's diesel. If it's petrol, I racked my brains about this one, if I'm honest, because I actually really like the hybrid. There's a 2-litre. It's an Ingenium engine. It's paired with a hybrid system. As long as that's charged up, it drives so well. So well. Admittedly, if it runs out of charge, which, that can happen, but I don't think that's going to happen the majority of time you're driving it. If it does, it does feel a bit laboured. And a 2-litre in a Range Rover doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But your options around that, you can go for a 5-litre V8, you can go for a 3-litre V6. To me, if you're not going to go for a V8 petrol, which I think a lot of you won't, it's the most expensive to run, although it's by far and away the most powerful. And if you are going to buy one, by the way, 2015 onwards, Land Rover really got on top of the timing chain guide issue that affects the earlier versions of this engine. I think that's a little bit of Jaguar collaboration there, as Jaguar were putting that engine in sort of their hot stuff, went into the F-Type, all that sort of thing. So for me, I like the hybrid. Now, you may have a different opinion on that, but from what I've seen reliability-wise, that 2-litre with the hybrid system seems to go pretty well. Not hearing lots of reports of failures. People will jump on that and say the Ingenium engine, that always fails. It breaks, the timing chain. The 2015 to 18 Ingenium diesel, it was rushed out. I mean, Land Rover won't say that, but that's an opinion I have. I think the emissions laws were changing. They had to get their new diesel engine in. But because it's badged Ingenium, and because the petrol's badged Ingenium, the 2-litre petrol got sort of tarred with the same brush. But actually, if you start looking at owner reports, maybe the very first ones, 2018, maybe they're still struggling a little bit when it comes to the petrol and timing chains and timing chain guides. But I just don't see that many reports and that many complaints. If it's sort of a money no object, I'd go for a V8. But I think a lot of you will have to be making that mixed opinion, a mixed choice of what to go for. So from my view, you go for the D300 diesel, you go for the hybrid. If it's got to be one of the early ones, 4.4 TDV8 or SDV8, I should say. But I just think if it's got to be reliable, those are the two to look at. Next, we've got the L460. This is the 5th generation Range Rover, and with this one I have mixed opinions. It's still quite a new car, so it's a bit unfair for me to sort of say this one's more reliable than this one, because almost all of them are under warranty. Most of them are being cared for by owners that, you know, if you're buying $100,000, pound, euro, whatever Range Rover, then if something's coming up and you've got a warranty, then really this is, you know, get a guy to come bring you a different car for the week, get it fixed, bring it back to me sort of deal. However, if you are looking at this point, I can sort of pull through some information from other vehicles that have had the engines that have gone into that to say that 3-litre diesel, the Ingenium, the one I mentioned, comes late in the day on the L405, that still seems like a really good engine. Now they offer it as a D250, D300, I think D350. I would just stick middle of the range D300. It's got the power you want, it's got good fuel economy, and if you go for the 250, I know some people will go 250 and then they'll think, well, just put your right foot a little bit harder down. But whenever you're labouring an engine just that little bit more, if people who are watching this are into tech, they'll know this idea of binned tech. I won't go and explain it, but the idea of sort of throttling back something that has the capability to do more, that's all that's really going on here. So from my view, you go to the D300. You can go D350 if you want, but D300, it's the nice middle of the range. You haven't pushed it too far. You're not going to push the car too hard because you've got the 250 model. 300 sits nicely in the middle. If it's the petrol, I know some of you just love V8s, and because this gets a newer V8, this gets the 4.4 V8. Some of you may be like, well, he's definitely going to say that. It's got to be that one, surely. I'm going to say the hybrid again, and I know people have their opinion on hybrids and electric vehicles in general. I just think hybrids are a great answer when it comes to being able to plug in, do say 30 miles, 50 kilometers on a charge. That will cover most people for their day to day. They've got a wall charger, electric as well for this sort of heavier vehicle. I think it's going to suit really, really well. But yeah, the 3-litre that it's paired to, so far, so good. So, you know, from my view, if you've got something that's reliable, you can get a more powerful version of it, and you can do it without it costing you a load on a fuel bill, then great. I'd just be a little bit cautious. This was where the Range Rover pricing, I know they're never cheap, okay? None of these were ever a few pounds down the local used car market, but maybe one that's been crashed and it's got some weird modifications to it. But this was the generation where Range Rover pricing really moved up. And I think Land Rover kind of said, we'll let other cars within their sphere of what they sell, try and take the market that used to exist for Range Rover, and the Range Rover brand is now going to go and try and challenge that sort of Bentley Bentayga, sort of bottom end of the Rolls-Royce market. And I can't, some people will be critical of that. It was sold out for the first year, so this is a company that's been struggling to make money. They can sell cars and they can throw them out the door at a higher price. I get it, but because of that, a lot of these cars will have had really high retail prices, into the six figures. And we're talking much further than Range Rovers ever have usually been for their. Is there ever a normal Range Rover? I suppose the normal spec Range Rover, the one that the non-celebrities, non-oil barons sort of buy, the ones that are not the big screaming V8. Because of that, they're still quite expensive at the moment. Now, that'll change. Depreciation always happens with these big luxury vehicles, but I just have that sort of secondary thought. If you're looking to buy one right this minute, can you take the depreciation? Because the worst thing that can happen for you when you're buying a used car is that you buy something with all this great expectation of what it is and what it's going to deliver for you, and maybe you work for it for a long time, maybe you've been dreaming of owning a Range Rover, and then I think there's a very good, some of you will watch Harry's Garage. So he brought this up on a video and he was saying, I think he was talking about supercars. So I won't go into it. If you want to watch his thing on that, you can do. And it's a good insight into this. But it's something I've always noticed when I sold cars. Whenever someone would come in and it's a car they really wanted, if that car had huge depreciation, I'm thinking, I once sold a brand new RX-8. It was the R3, very last of them. I think I've told the story before. Guy comes back after 6 months. Just not the right car for him. But I'd warned him, I gave him a good discount, but it's going to depreciate hard. And it did. And he had accepted it. He had his fun. He could accept it. It would have been a very different story if he thought he was going to get a lot more money than he could possibly get after 6 months. And I think it's going to be a similar story here. So if you've been saving for a while, if you're going to keep it for 10 years, fantastic, go for it. Okay. If you're looking at this latest 5th generation, and it's something you're thinking to keep for a couple of years, and if it loses half its value in that time, you're going to be upset. Have two thoughts about it. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying, just make sure you really are prepped in your mind, and maybe you've got a way of being comfortable with the depreciation, and that's okay. But just to be sure. Now, if you've watched all this all the way through and you're thinking to yourself, really am interested in going out there and having a look at cars, I've done another video and it's advising people on all the things you don't hear get told to you before you go and buy a car. So I'll link that video up after this one. You can check that out. But for now, have a great day and I'll see you next time.